A very good afternoon, everyone. I extend a warm reception to all of you to the 21st edition of IIM Bangalore's Vista, presented by Bank of Baroda, co-powered by Cloudfiles. We are indeed honored to host a diverse and distinguished panel today. We have Mr. Adil Zainul Bhai, Ms. Manisha Girotra, and Mr. Sandeep Srivastav for a thought-provoking panel discussion titled India's Century, Why Should the World Bet on India's Sustainable Growth? We talk about sustainability in terms of both being conscious of the climate as well as preparing our industries and workforces for lasting growth. Our audience can pose questions to the panel through the Q&A section on your screen. These questions will be taken up towards the last quarter of the session. I also urge the audience to leverage this opportunity and send the questions, please.
Good afternoon to our distinguished panelists. I'll briefly introduce our panelist here. So Mr. Adil Zainul Bhai is the chairman of Quality Council of India since 2014. He is involved in projects in infra, healthcare, education, coals, and others. He's also the chairman of Network 18 and TV 18 and is currently on the board of Reliance Industries, L&T, and Cipla. Mr. Adil retired as the chairman of McKinsey, where he founded the Minneapolis office. We welcome you to Vista, sir. Ms. Manisha Girotra is CEO of Moelis & Company in India. She was previously chairperson and country head for UBS in India, with a career spanning over 28 years with USB and Moelis in India. I'm elated to share that Ms. Girotra was the youngest CEO of a global investment bank in India at the age of 32. IIM Bangalore is honored to have you, ma'am. Heartiest welcome to IIM Bangalore.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here with all of you.
Mr. Sandeep Srivastav is the Director for Product Operations and Strategy for Microsoft ITC. His penchant for serial entrepreneurship has led him to successfully exit 3 startups and participate in over 8 startups' journey as co-innovator, mentor, and investor. During his journey, he has led product management for Microsoft billion-dollar product portfolios such as SharePoint and Office 365. Thank you for being here with us, sir. So without further ado, we would start with the opening comments from our panelists on India's sustainability journey so far and what the future holds for us in the future. Yeah, over to you, Adil, sir.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to join you all at IIM Bangalore. Of course, we're all trying to do this by VC these days, but it would have been terrific, and hopefully we can do it one of these days in person at the campus. It always brings a very different kind of interaction when we do that. But I'm delighted to be here on a subject that we all think a lot about, and lots of people around the world worry about that. So I'd start out with a couple of points, which is we've had a 30-year incredible journey of growth. And I think we have another 50 years to go. This growth for a country like ours is not something that is good for a few years. For us to reach our development potential and to improve the lives of our citizens, it's something that will go on for a long time. And within that time, there will be periods when everything will go well, and periods when some things go well and some things go badly. And that's fine in the sense that one can never give up, but this is the direction that we have to go on. And I think we are on a path of, we'll look back over this and hope that this will be another 30 years of fantastic growth that has changed the lives of our people. When we think about development, I don't think we should start out by saying that development is something that we're doing to attract capital or to attract investors from around the world or to attract people coming into India. I think the focus starts with what do we need to do so that, in fact, we can improve the lives of our citizens and come to a standard of living that we feel is comfortable for 1.4 billion people. To do that, we need to attract foreign capital, and we need to be seen as a country where companies can come, invest money, and do well, and bring the latest in technologies, ideas, business models, etc. So I would just flip it around and say the goal for the country has always been and should be our development, and the role of foreign capital and the role of investors, etc., is an enabler to get there. There is really no other way to be a closed society and get that kind of development. So why am I confident about this, and why do I think people will bet on sustainable growth in India? If you look over many years ago, for many years until about 2000, the year 2000, the total foreign direct investment in India never crossed $1 billion a year. It had stayed at that level for a very long time. And starting around early 2000s, it jumped from $1 billion to 10 billion. And I think the last year, we got 61 billion in investor flows. Obviously, there's something that people think is interesting. Otherwise, they wouldn't spend 61 billion here. We are always now, among the top few countries in terms of foreign direct investment, and continue to do that. I think changes in tax laws, changes in environment, changes in ease of doing business have all, and of course, the nature of the opportunity have all contributed to attracting capital, which is necessary for growth. And it'll continue to do that. And of course, we have to keep getting better, but I'm very confident that the systematic effort to create ease of doing business and to allow inflows of FDI into many industries will in fact fundamentally continue and will help us in many ways. The second point that I would like to make is that the economy, while we have opened up dramatically, the growth in the economy is still driven by domestic consumption. We are not as international in economy as many other countries are. And so therefore, our growth will always be balanced and will have to be driven by growth in domestic consumption, both private and public sector. And I think from that perspective, when we look at it, there's a lot to go. There's a sufficient rate of savings. If you look at our international reserves, they've grown to unprecedented levels. I think I read that it's now 646 billion or something like that. So we have a very stable situation compared to many times in the past. That's a good base to grow. I'd only like to highlight two areas, and then we can get into the discussion, that I think are very interesting for us to look at. Number one, India is among the most vibrant startup ecosystems in the world. Being in Bangalore, I'm sure at IIM Bangalore, you are all aware of that. I noticed that a large number of IIM Bangalore graduates now go to startups and or form their own startups compared to many years ago, and that this is the largest number of startups we've had in a long time. I think we are now at 50,000 startups by any measure in terms of venture capital investments, investments in Series A, Series B, the number of unicorns, the number of people employed by startups. It is terrific. It is higher than it's ever been. And I think other than probably the US, China, Israel, we probably have the most vibrant startup ecosystem in the world, which is driving change in every area. In the past, we always worried about technology being developed somewhere else and then coming to India. And I think today we are in a position where the application of technology and the development of many technologies, India is the leading force in. A great example of that is what we've done in CoWIN, what is happening in terms of the unicorns that have grown in India, what is happening in terms of Aadhaar, UPI, which is the unified interface for payments, et cetera, we are the leading edge of the application of many technologies, and that is fundamentally going to help the country continue to grow. So I wanted to point out the role of services and the role of the startup ecosystem in India as one of the big drivers. In terms of sustainable growth, I think we are probably among the most aggressive in terms of converting to renewable energy. The goal is to get 200 gigawatts of solar power in India, which would be a dramatic change compared to almost anywhere in the world. We are also pushing very hard on wind power. I think the combination of that will in fact help us make it sustainable. If you look at some of the targets that India has taken at COP25, we are well on our way to achieving those. And so as I look at all of these combined, if you step away from the drumbeat of negative stories about what is happening in India, but you look at it underlying, we'll see that despite many many things that have happened during COVID, or many individual areas where things have not gone well, overall, the trend continues for a sustained growth, I think, over the next 30 years. So I would say I'm very optimistic. I would look at it and say that most companies around the world and most countries who are thinking about investment overseas are very optimistic about India and continue to bring more money into India to invest. So I think I look forward to another 30 years of extraordinary growth. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I mean, truly mentioned that the ecosystem and the fact that we're opening up the economy is what will drive the next phase of the growth. We have Mr. Sandeep who's joined, so we welcome you again, sir. So we just looking at opening remarks on the topic. When we say sustainable development, we look at both the climate angle as well as the fact that we need to sustain this growth and prepare our workforces as well as the industries for the same.
Great. So first of all, thank you. Really happy to be part of this illustrious panel here. And sorry for the bit of a technical glitch in the beginning, and that took a bit of back and forth for me to come in and join the panel. And thank you, Mr. Adil, for sharing your thoughts. It's definitely heartening to hear about the kind of technology leapfrog we have done in the last 10 years in order to come up with technology interventions like UIDAI, like UPI, and essentially using those as a linchpin through the whole economy to digital acceleration. So definitely India is on a path to growth and acceleration. And at least I can represent the corporate point of view coming in from Microsoft. And the way we look at India is essentially India is a characterization of three economies or three countries: India 1, India 2, and India 3. And India 1 is really the affluent Indians who have the natural affinity to use technology. They are within the net of internet, and they participate wholeheartedly into the e-commerce ecosystem. India 2 essentially is the semi-urban or semi-rural population. Those are the connecting fabric between the India 1 and India 3. And essentially, these are the people who are the aspirers. They are the digital or internet users, but they're not really consumers. And India 3 essentially are the people who have not even begun aspiring. So when we look at India and when we look at empowerment, I think our vantage point is to see how we can really create a growth which is inclusive. I think how our honorable Prime Minister talks about Sashktikaran and empowerment. I think it has to be in all the corner of India. So that is part one. And I think and that is part one, that is about technology. And as we proceed further into the discussion, I can talk about how we look at emerging market, what dreams and fascinations India has about winning in India, and with a very inclusive approach, and then using it as a template to kind of also going and enabling and empowering other parts of the world in the emerging market. Now, coming to the whole fabric of ESG and how we look at sustainability, I think it's public knowledge now that we've taken a moonshot project to be carbon neutral by 2030, and then carbon negative by 2050. It really is a moonshot because I think leaders make promises that themselves know how to fulfill. So at least being part of this conversation, I'm aware we made those promises, and then we kind of look backward in terms of how do we really go and achieve it. And because it's not just about Microsoft, it's also about our customers, about our partners, our whole supply chain in terms of how we turn it around, and not just in the US where we are headquartered, but all across the world. Looking at our supply chain, looking at our process, looking even at our products. I think very simple things like how we build our features into the products. Our product can ensure less carbon footprint, using Teams instead of traveling, using very recently last year, there was a feature that was built into Xbox about reducing the power utilization during standby from 15 watt to 2 watt, right? Those are small things that just basically just have a multiplication factor, and they end up creating a net carbon positive footprint. And then we are looking at how we create a planet-size computer, which can really be used by not just by Microsoft, but all our customers in terms of furthering the agenda on the ESG. So coming specifically to India, again, I think very much aligned with the Moonshot project. We have started taking small steps, and I can talk about it as we get into the conversation about what we have done in India. But in parallel, essentially, we've also gone ahead and announced a $1 billion fund that supports this Moonshot project. And when we look at this fund, we are leveraging it in a variety of ways, but we are really looking at a three-tier approach. Tier one is essentially here and now in terms of what are the offsets or the carbon removal projects that can undertake that can impact the civilization in the first 100 years with a time horizon of 0 to 100 years. The next set, and these set of projects are focused primarily on soil and forest. Tier 2 essentially is with a time frame of 100 to 1,000 year, and Tier 3 is essentially 1,000 plus years. And the kind of projects you're funding there may just seem like a project of fascination or dream work, because there are companies who are essentially taking the carbon and figuring out ways to kind of package them and send them back into the earth, so that the whole the whole vicious cycle of the fossil fuel supply chain can just be reversed. So we're taking a we are really approaching it like a moonshot. This first year has been kind of defining. In the first year, we've been able to reduce our carbon footprint by 6%, and COVID had a very little part to play with it, because travel were reduced and there were net impact on the net movement of the people and businesses and supply chain. But I'm pretty humbled with the progress we made, and we're looking at the next 9 years and plus next 29 years in order to making progress there. But happy to share more as we move further into the conversation and take it from there.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much. Over to you, Manisha, ma'am. What do you think? So we've heard the macro and the economic growth level. We've heard the technology level from the technology point of view. So what do you think, from your viewpoint, where does the country stand and where are we heading?
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the panel once again. And Adil and Sandeep, I share your optimism and confidence. Let me just share with you my journey, in the last 50 years that I've seen what's happening in the Indian development and growth story. So if I were to cut to my childhood days, my father worked in a state-owned bank, so I had a lot of close interaction with industry and with small businesses, etc. Industry was basically completely controlled by people who could manage to get some licenses. Licenses were given out very selectively by the government. And it was a huge chore, as Adil and Sandeep will tell you, to get a license. So basically, between the government and a few business houses, they controlled the business. Cut to the individual level, I know my father was posted in Himachal, and because he was in a state-owned bank, he had to do a lot for financial inclusion. And he used to take us a lot of the small villages, etc. Let's say there was a landslide in many of the villages. Basically, the villagers got landlocked. There was no access to food. Half of them starved to death. The only food they got was either through the middleman, who charged some crazy rates, or there used to be food dropped by helicopter, in which case just the mighty and the large families managed to get most of the food. So growth felt very, very lopsided during my childhood days. Cut then to the time that I started my career in banking 28, 29 years ago. It was a very exciting phase. The government realized the importance of private capital and foreign capital. A lot of capital came into sectors which were till then seen as core, and sectors which are basically government, only government or private sector should operate in. And fabulous companies got created in telecom, banking. You saw the companies such as Bharti, Kotak, HDFC, Infosys, and these were really companies which created a lot of employment and created a lot of sense of pride in us as a country. Also, what was simultaneously happening at the individual level, that basically a lot of the new age industries that came up, such as IT services, pharma, consumer, generated a lot of employment. So about 400 million urban middle class got created, and they both had a voice and a purchasing power. So I think growth through my career felt far more equal. But I think what got left behind was the Bharat. I think you still didn't see that kind of growth go into rural India, etc., etc. They were basically just getting subsidies or SOPs at the time of elections. And, you felt a huge skew even then in the growth pattern. I think as Adil and Sandeep said, cut to 10 years ago, and the scenario has completely changed. And the reason it's changed is exactly what you said, which is really technology. The current government has really used technology to create a level playing field, both at the business level and at the individual level. So today, India's population is digitally empowered. There are about 1 billion bank accounts, 750 million smartphones. So, cut to my earlier example of helicopters having to airdrop food to now what happened when in the first phase of lockdown, when basically migrant workers rushed home. Each one of them, the government could get food, ration subsidies into their bank account when we did not create a poverty crisis like we did in the early years. So I think that's been really empowering at an individual level. At the business level, I think to contrast again to what I said in terms of either having licenses or having access to foreign capital, today small businesses are so empowered, and again empowered because of technology. If I were to just look at the sector of banking, which is where I work in, contrast initially to my childhood where there were just a few state-owned banks to when I started working, fabulous banks like HDFC, Kotak got created, but they were really catering to the upper middle class in terms of the individuals and to the large corporates, just because, quality of book, etc., is very important for these. Payments was completely the domain of these banks. Today, the payment system is completely upended thanks to UPI, Aadhaar, etc., right? Each one of the small businesses today, the B2B platforms that have been created, B2C platforms that have been created are being used. And today you have seen an organization such as Paytm being created, which will probably IPO soon and list at a market cap similar to some of the large banks, which took 30-40 years to create. So I feel really confident about the sustainability of the growth, just because of what technology has done in making the growth more sustainable. Today, growth is not restricted. Growth opportunities are not restricted just to the few, or not restricted to one part of the country, which is India and not Bharat. Another important aspect I want to quickly touch on is that, to make growth sustainable, there has to be access to capital, and equal access to capital, not like the kind that I mentioned earlier. And you've seen that, whether it's through the PE or VC markets, which Adil referred to, 40,000 startups created. How have they been created? They've been actually created because of the growth that VCs and PEs have fueled. There's been about, I think, $200 billion of PE VC capital that's come in the last 10 years. Contrast that with like about half of that before, in the decade before. And this capital has been available to, graduates like you who will graduate from IIM Bangalore in 3 years. If you have a good business model, you get access to that. That would never happen in the earlier years because you had to sort of show decades and trajectories of business models that had existed to get even access to a few dollars of capital. You see the private equity, which is basically now buying into large companies, doing control deals and basically pouring capital into the company. Public markets. Earlier, public markets was again accessible only to the very few. Reliance Industries, Tatas, Birlas were the guys who really got access to the public markets. Today, you saw the Zomato business model. So different a business model, not profitable, and it managed to do a fabulous IPO trade at some crazy multiples. It's something that we wouldn't have imagined. 15 years ago, a similar company started by a classmate of mine, Deep Kalra, Make My Trip, had to go and list in the US because, a business model which did not make money had basically no reason to find access and capital in the Indian markets. And today you've seen Zomato, you're seeing talk of Nykaa, Paytm, a lot of the tech companies which earlier you couldn't think could get access to the capital in India. So I think for all of these reasons and for all of the reasons mentioned by my esteemed panelists, I feel India's growth today is truly sustainable. Adil touched on the whole renewable efforts, so I don't want to repeat that. But because of all of these facts, the fact that it's more inclusive, the fact that there's more access to capital, and the fact there's more awareness on leaving a more sustainable business model for our next generations, I feel very confident on the Indian growth story.
Thank you, ma'am. You gave a very good reflection of how our growth has been so far and how we have come so far. But what I see here is that India has seemed to buck the trend of going from an agrarian economy to one that is driven by manufacturing and then moving to a service-led economy by leapfrogging the manufacturing phase by and large. So in your opinion, from the panel's opinion, what are the limitations of these service-led economy, and how sustainable is this growth? Are there certain sectors that we need to focus on specifically? Adil sir, we'd love to hear from you on this.
I think we should think a lot about the fact that in services, where some of the barriers were different in terms of participating, the Indian economy has done extraordinarily well, both in terms of domestically as well as internationally. Obviously, the Indian economy is quite dependent on services internally. I think 62% is services. But interestingly, if you look at our exports, service exports have done extraordinarily well and have stayed resilient even through the COVID times, and are starting to grow again. We have created world-class companies in services, and in fact, we've created world-class research centers in India in services. So it's not just Indian companies that have benefited and have helped the service sector grow in terms of exports and domestic, but I think there's over 1,000 R&D centers in the South in India from around the world as people recognize the value of the Indian technology talent. So I don't think it's a trade-off between the two. I think we have to grow all of them. And continued growth in services is a very, very important part of India's growth. Some service sectors have not done so well. So for example, technology services, IT services, BPO, business process services have done very well. But actually in financial services, we have not done as well in terms of exports. It's grown very well in India. It's not done as well in terms of exports, and we could do a lot better. A lot of reforms are taking place, including what's happening in Gift City, to bring financial services onshore from offshore, including things like aircraft leasing and various other transactions that I'm sure Manisha can talk about quite a lot. So I think we have to continue to grow service sector, and you always grow on your strengths. So services we do well in, and we should continue to grow that dramatically. We hit below our weight. We punch below our weight in manufacturing. That is absolutely true. And I think we have a great opportunity now as everybody's looking for a China +1 strategy to get growth in manufacturing. But I think one of the interesting questions that we have to continually face is the trade-off between services trade-off between manufacturing jobs that are jobs of the future, and creating manufacturing jobs the way China, Vietnam, and others created manufacturing jobs. What is the right balance between the two as you go forward? For example, do we want, in fact, a very high-tech auto sector, which as it grows, it actually does it with fewer and fewer people because of the level of automation? And yet it is one of the most productive sectors in India. We ship cars to 100 and some odd countries out of India, compared to many other manufacturing industries in India or anywhere else in the world. On the other hand, in textiles, which has not automated actually, and historically created a huge number of jobs, the reason we are not competitive has less to do with whether or not we have people who can do that, but that in fact the industry has not upgraded its technology and capability as we go forward. So it's not just a question of attracting any manufacturing. We have to think a little bit, we have to think hard about what is the entire ecosystem required to create manufacturing jobs. For example, one of the most successful manufacturing is in electronics, but it starts with semiconductors. Taiwan, China, and others have a great electronics assembly business industry, but it's also based on the component industry. And unless you can attract the component industries, you can't really build an electronics industry. India is starting to do that, and now we have at least 100 companies that are doing electronics assembly. But a lot of that is not as value added as it is in some other countries, because we don't have semiconductor manufacturing, which is $100 billion investment game. It's not a $1 billion investment game. So I think when we talk about manufacturing, it isn't one simple question of what is to be done. It is a much, much broader question of the kinds of industries we want to be in. For example, so I'll give you two examples. We do extremely well in pharma. India is India supplies generic medicine for the world. We've also seen that happen during COVID times, where India is, producing many drugs for the rest of the world, as well as producing vaccines for the rest of the world. We do very well in that. It is very high-tech manufacturing, and India has done extremely well. But we'd love to build the biotech industry, which is also another high-tech industry going forward. So I think trying to replicate what was done 50 years ago in some countries may not be the right path for India as we go forward in terms of creating manufacturing jobs. After all, it is a country of 1.4 billion people. It is the largest democracy in the world. It has a huge climatic zone difference. It has a extraordinary diversity in terms of people, religions, languages, everything you can think of. Our development path may not necessarily follow exactly what anybody else's development path was based on what made sense for them. So I think we do have to, even as we think about growth and manufacturing, we have to think carefully about what kind of manufacturing and services we want to grow in the country for the next 30 years. Thank you.
Absolutely, sir. So Manisha ma'am, maybe you could, just take up sir's point on the fact that we lack in exporting our financial services offshore, and then add your views on this fact, please.
Sure, thank you. I totally agree with Adil. If I could just step back and say that, look, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when each one of us went to China and saw the kind of manufacturing they had created and become the world's factory, we all beat ourselves up and said, why can't we do this? But because of our infrastructure and other constraints, we just couldn't add up to what China was doing. I think the way the world has moved today, we don't need to replicate those business models, as Adil said. We don't need to create those world-class manufacturing because, with technology, the kind of employment generation that manufacturing is going to be doing is limited. And that's where there comes the importance of services, financial services, IT services, etc., pharma, where we've done very well. And the theme there really, if you see across sectors, whether it's financial services, pharma, biotech, consumer, is that we really lead in intellectual capital in an English-speaking workforce in a country which is a democracy, open for business, young population. And I think that's really what we need to capitalize. That's where we need to show India's strength and say, look, while the opportunity of a trade-off from China is there, given people are de-risking from China, I think as Adil mentioned, in some of the sectors like textiles, etc., probably the countries such as Bangladesh, Vietnam, which have lesser bureaucracy, will win. I think where we need to really leapfrog and are doing so, given the kind of technology we are now developing and showing we are capable of, is in sectors such as financial services, pharma, tech. And I agree with Adil that, while pharma and consumer, we are sort of, going ahead and leading the way. In financial services, probably we aren't. And that goes back to the earlier point I made where, there was too much regulation around that sector. There was skepticism that, private sector shouldn't be allowed into this sector. Otherwise financial inclusion won't happen. Licenses were restricted. And I think technology upended that whole discussion. And that's why, as I mentioned, a lot of the fabulous financial services companies are being created neck to neck with banks, right? Paytm, Google Pay, BillDesk, etc., and the likes of Microsoft, etc., the way they're empowering our financial services sector. So I feel very confident that the next 20 years, you will see a very different financial services sector from the time when we started off and, you have to go to a bank, visit a bank manually to get your money, to then ATMs, to now doing everything on smartphone. We will lead on this technology and basically help it get replicated in the rest of the world, like in many other sectors. But I think it is lagging behind just because it was such a restricted sector. The other sectors tended to leapfrog the sectors that we mentioned, pharma, consumer, because IT services, because there really weren't so much regulation around it. This sector had so much regulation that it tended to lag behind. But 15 years later, you will see the sector again competing neck to neck with the other sectors mentioned by my panelist earlier.
Thank you, ma'am. So during our discussion, we touched upon the new startups emerging and the role of technology going forward. So Sandeep sir, my question is to you. That emerging markets such as India offer a lot of scope for collaboration and partnerships with companies, startups offering tech solutions in the direction of sustainability. As far as I know, even Microsoft has a partnership with Accenture where they are supporting startups and companies that are offering solution for social impact. So does Microsoft has any more such plans of building such partnerships in India going forward? And what are the initiatives by Microsoft specific to India in this regard?
Sure, Shivangeli, I think there was the audio problem. So if you can just, Shelly, if you can repeat the question in short.
Sorry, sir. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to know about the initiatives of Microsoft specifically going forward in this direction in sustainability. And does Microsoft has any plans of collaboration and partnerships with Indian companies that offer a solution for sustainability and social impact going forward?
Right. So I think it's a good segue from the last topic on which Mr. Adil and Ms. Manisha shared their thoughts. And I think I'll just add a few points there and then move on to this one. I think we definitely missed the manufacturing wave, but while we were on the agri wave, we were Soni ki chidiya. And I think back then we were playing it pretty smartly. And I'd say, I think if you look at it at a very uber level, it might seem like a service economy, but it's really not service economy, digital economy. And the one thing that's acted in favor of the Indians is that we have such talented people with such deep skill set and education that they've just taken the not just India but entire world on their shoulder in terms of bringing the world forward on the digital in this digital wave. So I think completely agree with Manisha ji and Nadal ji that we need to be very strategic in terms of what we pick up on. Last time when I was in China in the pre-COVID time, I think a couple of things stood out for me. I think we're still thinking that China is leading the way in terms of manufacturing, but I think for them it's done and dusted. I think for them data is the fuel now, and they're focused on AI. And if you don't participate in that way, I think we'll just see China taking over the rest of the. I mean, they've made sure that China is a very well-governed country, but then it will also come in to take over the rest of the world. I think the kind of trust issues China is landing with the rest of the world in a way is an opportunity for India, because India is still regarded as a neutral, trustworthy country with the kind of civilization we have had behind us. And I think it's time for us to kind of also look outward. So far, I think in the last 10 years, I would say we have been looking very inward in terms of fixing the fundamental issues with our technology, with our digital inclusion. I think all of that we've kind of mostly resolved. And completely agree with Adilji that we need to kind of look at the building blocks of digital economy, and that starts with chips, right? And one of the challenges with India has been the lack of that deep knowledge/education in the field of STEM that can really create the incentive mechanism for people to kind of go and make deep investments of hundreds of billions of dollars to create fab units and to create foundries, which can really help manufacture. Right now, I mean, especially with the COVID, the entire world is facing a chip shortage, but we don't have a story there within India. Okay. Now, I think it's a good segue into the question that you just asked me about what is Microsoft's role and contribution. How do we really look at participating in a sustainable way in creating a sustainable environment on us? So I'll talk about the emerging market, then I'll quickly come about ESG initiative. In the emerging market, looking at Bharat, India to in terms of how do we really make sure that technology other not just to the few, but can really the mass. That created this platform called Bharat Platform, which really leverages everything that is relevant in the context of the this segment of India. It starts with the language, the payment, the internet, basically solving all those basic problems, which helps us penetrate and make the technology usable. What we understand, I think, thanks to Jio, that data has become quite ubiquitous now. But in spite of that, I think the challenges we've had with during the COVID time, where data and internet has been spotty and choppy, at least in some parts of the India, it kind of becomes important to look at solving all these pieces of technology puzzle if we really want to make technology that is inclusive. So one of the very small example is we are in a very early stage of release of a product called Mishtu, which is essentially based on the thesis of assisted commerce, where we are partnering with CSC, which is a government entity, and village level entrepreneurs, and rolling this out across 1 million centers or micro retailers all across the country, so that these micro retailers can really become the hub for providing the digital empowerment in the space of leisure and utility to each and every Indians in every nook and corner of India. And if you really look at this segment, I think there are three big problems there. One is really the knowledge/education. The second is smartphone. Third is data, and fourth is payment. With the assisted commerce, we really are looking at circumventing each of these challenges so that technology that we create can really become relevant for this mass. So essentially, net, we are really looking at innovative ways to make sure that that we are able to cater to the segment of the audience which were not touched so far. And it's less about the business there. It's more about empowerment, living to our company mission of empowering every individual and organization on the planet to achieve more. So how do we really go and do that? And we do it in an inclusive way where we partner with the whole ecosystem that exists out there, be it large enterprises, small and medium businesses, even unorganized sector like gig workers and micro entrepreneurs, micro retailers, and make sure that in that whole system we create a value equation that serves the business economy for an inclusive growth for all the participants involved. On the sustainability effort on the environment side, I think one thing we have been doing is apart from looking at how we can offset the carbon footprint we create in India using our operations in the offices, and then in our data center, and then in the supply chain. We've been looking at a number of initiatives, and in that process, we've just been making sure that we are leveraging the startups and the ecosystem in the green space in order to create a growth that is inclusive and sustainable. Very simple examples which all of you can relate to. In our campuses, for example, we have moved away from the bottled water to RO-based drinking water. Right? This might seem pretty simple, but that's where the journey has to start. And then we have done tree plantation drive. We have planted more than 40,000 trees all across the cities where we operate. We have worked with the government to kind of take the land parcels, plant them, and manage them for the next 3 years until these trees graduate, these sapling graduate on to become trees. In our offices, we are also moved to complete green stationery. So these are all recycled stationery that all of us are kind of take pride and responsibility in using. We moved to solar water heating plants. And what we are also doing is we are basically not dumping the food that is left out from our cafeteria. We are essentially using these biodigesters to convert them back into gas and then use it to kind of fuel our cafeterias. This all done in the partnership with the local ecosystem of startups and local enterprises. We are also moving over to wind power in Bangalore, at least to a certain percentage, and then 87% of our total electricity consumption for example, Bangalore will also come from solar power purchase. We are moving over to that. Very simple things like instead of the normal UPS, we are moving over to rotary UPS. That also ensures a more sustainable footprint. We've also set up waste handling unit within our campuses to make sure that we focus on waste segregation, and hence we can avoid the pressure we have on the landfilling. Just yesterday, incidentally, our MD and myself, we were inaugurating the air-to-water plant. So there's this new device that can pull water out of thin air, which apparently is being done in India for the first time. But that essentially will be our way to kind of become water neutral in our campuses going forward. And going forward, we are looking at converting all our electric vehicles that are operated in the campus, and we have a huge number of them, to completely to EV vehicles. The timeline for that is end of FY22. Then we are looking at waterless urinals, chiller plant consolidation, EC fans. EC fans apparently are more sustainable compared to the normal fans we have. And then afforestation drive and these sort of things. But net, we're continuing to make small incremental changes, and these are really where we are trying to reduce our carbon footprint right now, and that's the first step, and we are doing it in partnership with the ecosystem around us. In that process, we're making sure that there is an inclusive growth and direction. And as we are doing this, we are creating footprints to make sure, and blueprints to make sure that other companies out there in India, if they really need to follow the learning we have in the context of Microsoft, we are able to share it and help others also make progress on this journey. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think that we can take cue from what Microsoft has been doing for other corporates as well going forth. So we have talked about what corporates are doing, where we need to invest, and what has been the overall economic landscape in India. I would now like to touch upon human resource as a matter of fact. And my question would be to you, Adil sir, that how can corporate promote sustainable thought process in employees and improve their engagement? And how do we retain, attract, and re-engage talent for sustainable growth? I hope I was audible. Yeah.
Yes, you are. Let me start out by saying that many corporations in India are now waking up to the need to do things in a sustainable manner. One, there's a lot of pressure on it, but also very interestingly, the investment climate is changing, and many funds around the world and in India are starting to look at companies through a sustainable lens. And as soon as there's pressure from the shareholders, then companies move very quickly to make sure that they are reacting to it. So they're already reacting to it quite a lot to begin with, and I'll give you some examples. But because of the rise of ESG funds, as well as the ESG ratings that are being given to companies, companies are now paying a lot more attention. I don't know if you are aware of the fact that in 1 week a month ago, there was a series of actions that from investors in Exxon and Shell and other oil companies, which for years had said that they would continue to develop oil resources, suddenly make a shift and say that they are going to pay a lot more attention to sustainable energy. And it was quite a shock in these companies. And ExxonMobil has said that they've got 2 directors on board who are paying attention to it. Shell has said that they will be completely they will be completely energy, they will move towards sustainable energy. So companies, and a lot of this happened because not only are they seeing the direction in which the world is going, but also because their investors are saying that they will not invest in companies that are not proactively playing a role in improving sustainability, right? So one is, I think everybody is paying attention to it. Investors are paying attention to it, so companies are paying attention to it. Large companies, for example, you can see that chemical companies in India and plastics companies in India are moving towards where they could recycle 100% of the plastic. Today, there is a fair amount of plastic that's recycled, particularly for certain kinds of plastics. The plastic bottles, etc., are now recycled almost to the tune of 60%. But how could you recycle all plastics so that it becomes a circular economy? Not only because it makes sense to do that, but also to come up with models that allow you to do this in a reasonably profit neutral way, as opposed to just doing it as a CSR activity. So I think people are starting to fundamentally change their operations at large scale so that they become more sustainable. Secondly, of course, when if a company starts saying that they are going to look at their suppliers to make sure that they are doing things in a sustainable way, then that forces all the suppliers to change. If you look at what happened in quality in automobiles, as an example, when Maruti started becoming very successful in India, they wanted all their suppliers to meet certain quality standards. And so the entire parts industry then fundamentally improved. And I think the same thing is happening even on issues of sustainability. When the large and leading companies take a role and say, we are not only going to do things in a particular way, but we will ask our suppliers to become compliant on this, and that we will check whether or not they are in fact doing their operations in a sustainable way, then all the suppliers change. And then those suppliers apply to their suppliers, etc., and it goes down the line, right? So I think large companies can play a very, very big role in helping drive this and drive this thinking. And many of the leading companies in India are doing that. I think the second part is, of course, the government plays a very important role in terms of the standards it sets and what it expects from it. And, in terms of sustainability, in terms of usage of water, etc., where the government intervenes, it makes a huge difference. How much of the water is being recycled is a great example of sustainability. If you look across the 4,000 urban local bodies in India, the percent of wastewater that was being recycled was very low, actually. The percent of wastewater that was being treated was very low. Over the last 10 years and over the next 10 years, that proportion is going to grow dramatically. A place where you can actually see the difference is there was a huge program to clean up the Ganga, as you know. There's 1,000 nallas that flow into the Ganga. And so the first step was stop putting more garbage into the river before you can clean up the river. And actually 110 plants, sewage treatment plants are going up to treat the water that is going to go into it. And actually you will see a huge difference. There already is a huge difference. The reason I know this is Quality Council of India measures what is happening at those nallas, and we're keeping track of how much water is being treated and how much is not being treated, et cetera, et cetera. So we know exactly how much improvement that is happening. So I think at various levels, large companies, government, individual knowledge, and individual awareness, I think is starting to make a difference in terms of how people are looking at sustainability.
Right, absolutely. So Manisha, circling back to the optimistic growth story of India, we don't see enough on-ground activity as opposed to what the financial markets show us. So we have the indices skyrocketing every now and then. We have IPOs listing and giving us almost 100% gains, and we're also looking at models like Zomato and as well as others, which at one point we never thought would ever make this sort of a listing here in India. So, what is your view on this mismatch between actual on-ground activity in the manufacturing sector, but on the other hand, the financial market skyrocketing every now and then?
So, thanks for the question. Before that, can I just quickly add to what Adil said on sustainability, because it's an area that I'm passionate about. I think another important aspect of creating a sustainable workforce is that India needs to do a lot more in terms of gender diversity. Whether it's at the entry level, all of you who are graduating from IIMs, today I think parents are investing as much in daughters' education as their sons. I think there is to be a lot more awareness amongst corporates to hire more girls, more women at the entry level. Then one thing is to hire them. The other more important thing, which I see again and again through my career, is how to retain the women. I think we've been so rigid in terms of wanting 6-day work, Saturday working, work always from office, not having enough creches, etc. for women. And as a result, you've lost a lot of women in the workforce, a lot of talent in which you actually invested human capital. Then you lose because, the woman just can't keep up in terms of having a family life and working. So I think re-entry into the workforce is again, and I think COVID has shown you that, right? Here we are sitting in, all of us in different places and having this webinar and talking to each other. And I hope there's a lot of learning that the corporates will retain in terms of getting women back into the workforce by genuinely offering them flexible work, flexible hours, etc. 3-day work from home. I mean, Microsoft, I'm sure Sandeep will tell you, there's alternate days that they'll be working from office and home. So I hope a lot of that is done to retain the woman talent, which you've actually invested so much in. I mean, there's a study, I think, by McKinsey, who will tell you that there's $700 billion more to be added into GDP just by retaining the women in the workforce. So I hope some of that happens. Again, at the board level, I'm on board of several companies, and I think I'm the only woman director on the boards of the Indian companies, just because it's stipulated by law. Why is it just one woman? There should be more women. There are enough working women that you can pull into. I'm on the board of this global company called Naspers, and it's an equal split between men and women. I don't think it's even an agenda point. So I think at every level, startup ecosystem again, I mean, the only unicorn startup is Nykaa, which is started by a woman. So I think at every level, I would like to see more to be done for the women workforce, because I think that genuinely adds to the economy. And I just wanted to add to that on all the points.
So if I just may, I think this was the next question, in the sense that I also wanted to touch upon the fact that there are certain industries which are sort of niches and clouds. For example, when you look at the auto sector, almost none of the mainstream auto sector companies in India do have women at the CXO level. So, why are certain industries absolutely exclusive of women, whereas we do see, for example, a lot more women in banking and other sectors. And, we would love to have the men also talk about this particular aspect.
Sure, I can quickly give my views. I think initially it started off, so when I started off my career, it was a natural progression that you either go into the government, try and become an IS officer, or go into banking. These were really the two industries that were open because of the safety reasons. Most manufacturing was in remote villages, etc., where it was difficult for most families to send their children, send their girls out. There was just a general sense of discomfort. So I think as a result, these became very male dominated. And tended to stay that way because it was just seen as manufacturing was a domain of the men. STEM had very few girls, not enough girls were going into engineering colleges, and that basically spilled over into the industry. This is all a reflection, and I don't want to spend time on that. It's a different topic, but this is all a reflection and spillover of the patriarchal society that we lived in, where things like manufacturing was seen as a male domain. Women could be good in nursing, caregiving, maybe some extent financial services. And don't forget, financial services also, the reason women were given opportunity was because of the push that India gave to retail banking 20-25 years ago. And it was thought a woman would be good in retail banking, where people come to meet people in the branch and a woman would have a higher empathy level. That's really how women started. It wasn't because they thought that women would be good in investment banking or corporate banking. We pushed our way into that gradually from retail banking, but the entry point for each of us women when we joined or graduated from business school was retail banking. So I think a lot of it, even in financial services, happened because women pushed their way in once they got the entry point. Sectors such as auto, steel, manufacturing, very few women. As you said, I'm on the board of Ashok Leyland, and I always keep telling the board that, look, the next CEO should be a woman. Why is it only a man? And you don't even see that happening for, at the second level. So a lot more needs to be done. And I think the men should comment on the fact that a lot more needs to be done. And I hope that COVID has shown that, women can work as hard as men from anywhere in the world, and that flexibility, if you're able to give to women, I think you'll see them rise to the top in all these industries, just like we saw in financial services. I don't know whether you want to take the comments of Adil and Sandeep on that before I answer the other question you asked me. However you want to do it.
So we could have Mr. Sandeep's thoughts quickly, and then passing it on to Mr. Adil, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the area that I feel passionate about. I have 2 daughters, and the team that I manage in Microsoft has 80% representation of women. So it's a reverse problem I have of gender diversity. But I'll say essentially we, at least I can talk in context of Microsoft, we value diversity and then ensure inclusion and belonging because it's the need of the business. We can only build inclusive product if we have a diverse representation of the demography in our workforce. And for that to happen, there at least has to be 50-50 in terms of gender representation. There are other dimensions to diversity as well. And Microsoft has been very, again, one of the companies which has been kind of front-running the agenda on diversity, inclusion, and belonging. But at least in the context of India, I think there is another problem. And that problem is the gender stereotype we have, the patriarchal society we have, and the culture we have. I think in all of this, I think culture really plays a big part. Be it sustainable growth, be it even education for that matter. I think the good thing that has happened in the last 10-15 years is that the power equation has shifted from muscle power to brain power, and that has created a level playing field, irrespective of the segment of society or what element of diversity you're coming in from. This is the time when not just indigenous companies, but even MNCs like Microsoft are doubling down in India. One of the key challenges we see here is that I think there's a problem at the source, and there are 2 problems. One is the employability of the education system within India is low. Right. So though there are so many people who are getting generated or graduating every day, they cannot all be employed because they are not graduating with a standard yardstick of quality. That's one. And then there is a problem of gender representation right in the education system, because you go to the classrooms, you'll not see 50-50 there. And there are multiple reasons why that happens. I think we need to kind of figure out a way to fix that problem at the source. There's another problem, which is the problem of education inequity. I think our government has introduced this thing called right to education, but then education is quite expensive. And if it's not expensive, it is bad quality, right? So how do you make sure that it is good quality and it is equitable across the gender, across the regions, if you really want to create a workforce which is high quality and which can really help move the digital and the digital economy and the industry forward. So there's one of the realizations we have in Microsoft is there's 1.39 billion population in India. That's like huge population, percentage of population from the world. So one of the reasons why it's successful is because in the 1.4 billion population, it's pretty easy for us to fish out 10,000 smart engineers and kind of make them tick corporates, right? But if we really look at the scale in terms of the percentage of people who are really participating in this whole revolution, it's a very minuscule percentage. We really need to figure out a way in which there is more participation from all diverse angle into the digital industry for the needle to move in a sustainable way. There's no reason why only a tier 1, tier 2 city resident should be coming in and working in this industry, and not others, right? So that's where I think I thought I'll share my thoughts, and I'd love to hear Adilji on this.
Absolutely. Over to you, Adil,
sir. Thank you. And this is a subject that people have been working on for a very long time, and in most countries we've made some progress, but a lot more has to be done. And I think in India, let's take all the different elements to it, or some of the elements. I think to add on to Manisha's standpoint, which is women are underrepresented in Indian boardrooms, and it's interesting that it took a government fiat from Ministry of Corporate Affairs that you have to have one woman director at least, and one woman independent director to really make a dent in the representation of women in boardrooms. So it really took a stick. And it sort of worked a little bit, and there's a lot more to be done in that, which is that it should be, we should create and have a much larger number of women directors and much larger number of women at all stages of a company. Many of the boards that I am on have also struggled over time to get the right number of women directors on it. Over and above just the statutory requirements. It's also quite interesting that, in terms of the statutory requirements, the public sector enterprises actually are still many of them are in violation of this edict to have at least one woman director. Many of them don't even have one. And they're government companies, and something could be done on that. This is a generational challenge to increase participation of women in the workforce at all levels, and in many, many industries. So it's not an easy solution, as you pointed out, Sandeep. It starts at the education level. In some of the work that we've done in education shows that in many districts that are much poorer, the dropout rate of the literacy rate of both boys and girls have improved dramatically. But the gap between boys and girls in many districts has actually remained the same. The gap they've increased the numbers, percentages, but the gap is still there, and partly because of funding constraints, partly because of many other societal issues in those districts, etc. That in fact it starts at very early at the secondary education level, actually, is where you really start seeing a lot of differences. So those are structural issues that I think really have to be worked on. What is heartening, however, is that in many cases, especially in university education, proportion of women finishing university education has increased. Even in STEM, especially in pure sciences, the percentage of women is increasing. Not as fast as anybody would like, but it is increasing somewhat. And I think the success story, nothing breeds success like success. And the success stories of, Manisha and others like her who are blazing a trail will encourage a very large number of women to succeed compared to the role models that they had some years ago. I don't know if you saw that the announcement of the new LIC managing director is a woman, which is wonderful. As one of the largest institutions that is going to IPO in India, it'll be the largest IPO in India. To be led to the IPO by a woman is a very strong and powerful signal. So I think the role models of, Nykaa, Falguni as the founder of Nykaa and going public, will have enormous numbers, will energize and encourage and inspire a large number of women, just as the success of our first generation entrepreneurs in the IT industry energized and inspired a large number of people to go into that. And the current, many of the current unicorns are a result of that, right? And the same way, I hope that the first generation of women who are doing extraordinarily well, like Nykaa, will in fact inspire a larger number of people. But honestly, it's a long trek. We have to keep working at it and keep working at it and keep pushing it, because the natural forces have not yet aligned to make a huge difference here. So we have to keep pushing on that. Thank you.
Lisa, ma'am, if you could have a quick answer from you on the financial markets question, please.
I think your financial markets question related to the fact that while you see a lot of capital coming into India through the public markets and private equity, it's not probably translating into the same excitement in manufacturing, etc. I think that's where I disagree with you a bit, because firstly, let's step one. We need access to capital. We didn't have access to capital. All we had till 20 years ago was state-owned banks, which had a broader social agenda, lent to 3 or 4 groups, and that was really it. And that's really what stifled industry. We had very lackluster IPO markets. We had no debt markets. We had no bond markets, and we barely had any foreign investor interested in us. The opening up of the economy and all the sectors led to capital coming in. The large 1.4 billion people with a 400 million middle class basically made us an economy strong enough to invest in ourselves. If Microsoft Sandeep is here and investing the kind of dollars, he's not doing it just for exporting stuff out of India. He's doing it because he sees the massive opportunity in India for Indians by Indians. So I think the fact that capital is coming in is critical. How are these new unicorns created? They are created because there's so much VC and PE capital coming in. The Sequoias, the Tigers, the Alibabas, Tencents have all funded this growth, right? So I think that is the first premise for sustainable growth, which is that we need capital. We cannot be just having the kind of crisis Adil referred to at the beginning of the conversation, where India had to pledge its gold, etc., because we just couldn't service our economy. So it's finance is raw material, right? So the fact that and as a raw material, you can't have enough of at any point. You couldn't have funded 40,000 startups if you didn't have it. Is it not generating the same kind of excitement in manufacturing, etc.? I don't think so. I think it is generating. The reason it's not generating it in the traditional way. We are not seeing a large, manufacturing facility like that, the kind China is creating, because we are leading very differently. We know that race with China is probably lost, or is difficult to catch up to. We are leading with our intellectual capital. And basically, I don't know whether you recall, but IT services companies, when Y2K happened, everyone said it's over. It's over for the tech sector in India. All these Infosys, Wipros, TCS will cease to exist. We reinvented ourselves. Then we reinvented ourselves to say, we can create top-end technology. So I think we're addressing it in a very different way, where the excitement is coming across sectors, services, agri, the kind of technology development happening in agri to make the small farmers' business sustainable is what is really the capital, where the capital is going, and ag tech, etc., etc. So I don't think you will see the kind of traditional excitement, will you see the largest steel plant being created, of the scale of China. I don't think that's what we are aiming towards, because, that's just replicating someone else's model. We are leading with our own unique model, and that's what the world is excited about, because the world has moved away from that very traditional manufacturing where so much disruption is happening. All of you graduating from IIM, I think, will have to reinvent your career 3 times or 4 times, because business models are going to change so much. And why the world is excited on India is because India is showing extreme adaptability to these new business models again and again. We've demonstrated that we can rise up to the challenge, and that's why the capital is coming in. So I feel the excitement is being replicated in the real sectors too. Would I like it to be faster and more? Of course, we would all like it to be more, because there is red tapeism, there is bureaucracy, which we would want, less and less of it to happen. But I think what tech has done is that it's taken a lot of the government away from the business, right? A lot of it now can be just done using the tech platforms, the UPIs, Aadhaars, etc., the payment gateways. So I think I feel very positive that, with a very differentiated business model, we will show how you can lift a country of 1.4 billion people without following the traditional business model.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that genuinely adds a lot more and gives us a lot more points to think on, and especially the young graduates. that we have on the call. And talking more closer to the student community. So my question is to Adil. So since you deal with a lot of human resource and the human capital that we provide to the country, the skilled sector, which has sort of been pushed or being forced to work in the unskilled sector during this pandemic, as well as students who are sort of learning online and, more so sadly in the tier 3 villages who do not have access to education anymore. Do we see a skill lag when we say 2 years down the line, our economy does pick up and we do ride that steep growth phase again?
Let me separate that into two different areas. For example, I think, for a long time, we've tried to figure out as a country, what are the skilling gaps and how can we help people get the right skills for the right jobs. COVID created a big dislocation and disruption in the job market in India. I mean, a very large 80% of Indian jobs are not the formal jobs. They're in the informal sector. And there, things are different. And in fact, they don't have the same protections and they are not managed in the same way. For example, a large number of people who are in construction, etc., are in informal jobs. They're not in formal jobs in a factory where they have, etc., etc. And the new labor code is meant to address some of this. So one, when there's a very large unorganized sector, the challenges of skilling are very interesting and different. So let me give you an example. Today, as the economy is coming out of COVID, we can already see that there are labor shortages in different areas. For example, take construction. Actually, there is more construction going on, and there's a huge shortage of laborers. One of the companies that I'm on the board of is, desperately sending actually people to villages to try and get back some of the masons, some of the carpenters, some of the pipe fitters, some of the welders who went back home because they want them to come back. And actually people are coming back, but not the same people and not the same skill level people. So they have to run their own skilling programs to teach people the skills necessary for them to work on some of the construction sites, how to drive tractor trailers, how to drive bulldozers, etc., etc. The good news, I would say, so there is a dislocation. Even if you forget about the overall level of skilling required, there's always a mix shift going on, and the ability of both the private sector and the government to respond to those skill shifts, and therefore provide people who can do certain kinds of work is, I think, very critical. Generally, the private sector is able to adjust to that very, very quickly. So, for example, schools will spring up and companies will provide training for the kinds of jobs that are required, rather than just depending on government training programs to do that. So now coming to the good news on it. The good news on it is that in the past, most skilling had to do with physical presence somewhere and the ability to deliver skilling through physical locations only. With the advent of digital and what is happening during COVID, and the fact that 99% of India will have access to 4G, all of a sudden you can change the skilling paradigm dramatically. So, originally to train 10,000 people would take a certain amount of space and a huge number of trainers. Today, we can do that much faster as a result. And therefore, our ability to adapt to the shifts that are taking place is going to be much, much better. So I think as we come out of COVID and as the economy picks up, we will see many of these dislocations. And using technology, we'll be able to kind of find opportunities for people to reskill them for the new kinds of jobs that are coming up. I think in terms of students who are graduating from the best universities and the most prestigious universities, including IIM Bangalore, obviously, at this stage, I think the opportunities actually will be very, very good. I don't know what happened this year during the recruiting cycle, but I would expect that there will be a lot of demand, and there will be a lot of demand, not just from traditional sources, but from the startup ecosystem, as I said. So I don't think at the top end, there will be any shortage or any issues in terms of job creation. I think in terms of the other parts of the country that depended on, or the other folks who depended on unorganized sector, that's where this mix of skilling is going to be very important. I know many companies are taking this up as a huge effort, and I'm sure Sandeep will talk a little bit about what Microsoft is doing and how they're addressing the challenge of skilling as an example of what some of the companies are doing.
Over to you, Sandeep, sir, and any advice that you would have for all the graduates or all the about to be graduates for the call.
Yeah, so I can, and I'll come to the advice bit. Definitely, we do a lot of hiring from IIM Bangalore, and a lot of your alumni are actually part of the program management discipline, specifically in Microsoft, where they're really helping us shape the technology of the future. So I think that's one part. But I think what has happened in the last couple of years is that India has also ended up creating or opening up the brand India in the mind of the investors outside. Earlier, at least in the context of Microsoft, I can say that India was not looked upon as a destination where devices or hardware projects can be done. It was not looked upon as a destination where security and compliance can be done. In the last 3 years, we've just gone around and kind of figured out that that was more of a racket or a myth, and that's not the reality. India has such great talent on hardware, on security and compliance, that we were able to create the SEED team. And now we are at a verge where we are really working with a lot of the academy out there to make sure that we can run joint programs in order to create the awareness for these kind of streams that can actually, that are really these streams for the future: hardware, security and compliance, design, and data science are some of the things that that I think need a good amount of academy and industry partnership. So that's one piece we have been doing. And on the CSR front, we've been running this skilling program at large, and a lot of it is also is a work in motion in India. We recently partnered with Apollo during the COVID time to run the upskilling program for the nurses, which was called the Angel program. And our realization during that time is that I think the world has changed. Earlier, when at the time of hiring, I think the recruiter would kind of go and look at the pedigree of the individual, which all companies have they worked in, what are the skill set they have acquired. But the realization, the new word is that the job roles have changed, the job responsibilities have changed. So that does not really give a one-to-one match between what the companies are looking for and what is really existent on the resume. So now we're pivoting over to kind of just take a look at the skills so that if there are individuals who want to switch over from one discipline to another discipline, it becomes easier for them to switch. For example, communication, presentation could be a skill. But if you say that, oh, I'm an executive coach, right? An executive coach can never become a communication manager. But if you really do the match on the skill parameter, it becomes easier. So what I'll, I mean, that has been a realization I thought I share, but I think coming to the advice, I think all of you are young and quite brilliant. This generation that you have lived through in the last one and a half year is actually qualifies you to be called Gen C, is what I just discovered yesterday. Generation COVID, right? Gen Z ke baad Gen C hai. So it gives you superpower. In fact, I think in today's world, at least in the tech industry, a lot of the work is actually getting done in the virtual environment. When we began, our fear was that being locked down and working from our home, an organization of size 140,000 employees all across the India, all across the world, will it ever be able to collaborate and run and be the first responder to the first responder? Because our customers, Fortune 500 companies, are running on technology we are creating, and all of them are really going through a huge amount of churn and digital transformation during this time. And thankfully, our realization was that it can be done. Our second worry was all the new hires who are joining Microsoft and they've not had the human connect at the face-to-face, at the personal level. Will they be able to survive and fit into the fabric of a corporate? And again, our realization there was that we passed that with flying color. In fact, our attrition rates have been lowest, our employee satisfaction have been the highest, our company performance has been high. I'm saying it in the context of Microsoft, it is true in general for tech industry, at least the industry that I represent. So I'll say, I think there's a lot of baggage that COVID brought along with it, but there's also a lot of learning. I think I'll encourage all of you to kind of take that learning, make it your superpower. And as you look at creating your career out there, use your superpower, be aware of what your strengths are, what your skills are, and then be very mindful of what is the zone of discomfort that you're walking in, because all your learning will really come in when you step into the zone of discomfort. So be very conscious about it. Sign up for your zone of discomfort, and make sure that when you're getting into a new organization, pay specific attention to the people equation, because what will make you successful in a job is your EQ. What will sustain you in a job is your EQ, not your IQ. What will get you into a job is your IQ. And EQ is really about how you create those human equations. How do you do impact and influence? How do you network? How do you connect with people at the human level, not at the selfish level, not at the level of getting your work done, but figure that out. At least that has been my learning working in Microsoft for 16 years. So I thought I'll share as all of you are looking at either beginning or restarting your career after your management education at IIM.
Thanks a lot, Sandeep sir. So as we close this session now, on behalf of Team Vista, I extend my gratitude to Mr. Adil Zainul Bhai, Miss Manisha Goyatra and Mr. Sandeep Srivastava for taking out time from their busy schedules and talking to us. Today's session touched upon a multitude of topics, including India's sustainable growth journey so far, the enablers of growth going forward, developing a technology-enabled ecosystem, balancing growth of various sectors, corporate responsibilities and initiatives, building a sustainable workforce and women inclusion in workforce, advice for us, among others. The discussions were truly enlightening and thought-provoking. We went past the allotted time, which shows how engaging the session was. As a small token of our gratitude, we have made a contribution to Enrich Lives Foundation in each of your names. The contribution has helped serve 3 square meals to 10 children impacted adversely by COVID-19. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's session, and I'm sure that there would have been a lot to learn from this session. Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks a lot, ma'am, again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.